Some doors stay locked for a reason. This one had stayed locked for longer than the young woman standing before it had been alive. A brass key, cold and heavy, trembling in her hand. An old man behind her, silent, watching the way a person watches someone step toward the edge of something they cannot yet see the bottom of. And on the other side of that clean, untouched wood, a room, waiting. She did not know yet that the walls inside were covered with her own face, that hundreds of frozen moments from a life she had spent believing no one was watching had been hanging there in the dark, year after silent year. She only knew that her heart was pounding, that her hands would not stay still, that something behind that door had been waiting a very long time for her. The lock turned, and everything she thought she knew about who she was about to come apart. For most of her life, the girl believed she had slipped through the cracks of the world without leaving a single mark, that no one, anywhere, was thinking of her, that if she simply stopped existing on some quiet afternoon, the days would carry on exactly as they were, and not one person would feel the shape of the empty space where she used to be. Her name was Grace Bennett. She was 25 years old, and on the night this story begins, she was sitting alone in a small rented room at the edge of a sleepy little town, holding a single cupcake with one thin candle pushed crookedly into the middle of it. The flame trembled in the draft. Outside, the rain tapped against the window like fingers that wanted to come in but didn't quite dare. There were no cards on the table, no wrapped boxes with bright paper, no voices in the next room laughing about something she had missed. There was only the soft hiss of the radiator, the smell of melting wax, and a young woman watching a tiny fire burn slowly down toward her fingers. She had learned, a long time ago, not to expect more than this. When you grow up moving from one house to another, from one set of strangers to the next, you stop waiting for the door to open and for someone to be glad that you walked through it. You learn to fold yourself smaller. You learn to take up less room. You learn to need almost nothing at all. And somewhere along the way, without ever quite deciding to, you begin to believe that maybe you were simply the kind of person the world was built to forget. Grace closed her eyes. She made the same wish she had been making since she was small enough to need a chair just to reach the table. The wish never had real words. It was more like a feeling, a quiet, aching hope, sent out into the dark, like a child dropping a coin into a well and listening for a splash that never seems to come. Please, let there be someone out there who remembers me. Then she leaned forward and blew out the candle, and the little room went dim. There are people who fill their homes with photographs, walls crowded with faces, shelves lined with little frames, a wedding here, a graduation there, a baby held up to the camera by hands that clearly adored it. Grace had none of that. What she had was a necklace, a small silver heart on a thin chain, gone soft at the edges from years of being held in nervous fingers. She wore it every day, tucked beneath her collar where no one could see it, resting against her chest like a second, quieter heartbeat. Inside, behind a tiny hinge that no longer closed quite right, was a photograph so faded it had become almost a ghost of itself. A woman, smiling, her mother, and below the little picture, pressed into the metal in letters worn nearly smooth by touch, were a few words she had read so many times they had stopped being words at all and become something closer to a prayer. No matter what happens, I will find my way back to you. Some children leave their childhood carrying boxes, toys, old report cards, a shoebox full of birthday cards, saved by someone who cared enough to save them. Grace had left hers carrying a single silver heart and a sentence she had never once been able to prove. She had no memory of her mother's voice. That was the cruelest part. On the night she let herself think about it, she could remember a feeling, warmth, the vague impression of being lifted into the air, the ghost of a hand smoothing her hair back in the dark, and the soft hum of something that might have been a lullaby. But the actual sound, the true voice of the woman who had given her life, had faded somewhere across the years. A song you loved as a child slips away, note by note, until only a few broken pieces remain, and even those you are no longer sure you remember correctly. She had been very young when her mother was taken from the world, too young to truly understand what the word gone was meant to carry, old enough to spend the rest of her days quietly feeling the weight of it. In the daylight hours, Grace worked with her hands. She mended old furniture in a small workshop tucked behind a hardware store at the quiet end of the town, pieces that other people had given up on and thrown away. Chairs with broken legs, tables scarred by decades of careless cups and hot plates, dressers so battered and water-stained that their owners had finally decided they were beyond saving. She loved that work. She loved the smell of sawdust and linseed oil that lived in her hair long after she went home. She loved the slow, patient hours spent running her palm over rough grain, finding the good wood hidden beneath the damage, coaxing something graceful and warm back out of something the world had already decided was finished. Maybe, if she had been the kind of woman who spoke such thoughts out loud, she might have admitted to herself why she did it, that somewhere deep inside, a stubborn part of her still believed broken things could be made whole again, that what has been wounded does not have to stay wounded, that even the things that have been left behind, abandoned, written off as worthless, can still be worth saving. But she didn't say such things out loud. There was no one to say them to. So she simply worked, and went home, and held the small silver heart against her chest in the dark, and listened to the rain, and waited for a morning that always seemed to arrive looking exactly like the one before. It was a gray, ordinary morning when the telephone rang. The kind of morning that gives no warning at all that the entire shape of a life is about to bend in a new direction. Grace nearly let it ring out. She had her coat half on. A cup of coffee was going cold on the counter, and a chair waited in the workshop with its joints loosened, halfway through being saved. But something made her reach for it. The voice on the other end belonged to a man. Older, careful, a voice worn smooth by long years of saying difficult things gently to people who weren't expecting to hear them. He told her he was an attorney. He said he was handling the final affairs of a man who had recently passed from the world, a man of some wealth. And then he said the man's name. Grace waited for the small click of recognition. It did not come. She had never heard that name in her life. She had never met the man, never shaken his hand, never passed him in a doorway or crossed a street to give him room. She nearly told the careful voice as much. She nearly said that he had reached the wrong person, that he wanted some other Grace in some other town with some other lonely childhood stacked up behind her. But before she could shape the words, the attorney spoke again. And what he said made the cold little room go suddenly still. In his final wishes, the man had left one very specific instruction. There was a room, a single locked room, inside his house, and it was to be opened by one person. Only one. A pause crackled down the line. Then, very gently, the attorney read aloud the name that had been written into the will. Grace Bennett. For the first time in longer than she could remember. Someone, somewhere, had known exactly who she was. She told herself, the whole drive there, that she could turn around at any moment, that she owed this stranger nothing, that a wiser woman would stay home, lock her own small door, and let the dead keep their secrets. But she kept driving. The house sat alone on a wooded rise above the town, half swallowed by tall, dark pines that leaned together at their tops like people sharing a secret they did not want overheard. A long gravel road curved up through the trees toward it, winding and slow. A road that seemed to carry you out of the ordinary world and up into some quieter, older one, where the air feels different and time moves at its own unhurried pace. Grace drove it with both hands tight on the wheel. The pines closed in on either side. The morning light went thin and silver between the branches, falling across the road in long pale stripes, and the knot in her stomach pulled tighter with every turn. It was not the size of the house that frightened her. It was not the money or the strangeness of it, or the heavy gray sky pressing low over the hills. It was a single question, a question that had circled her like a moth around a porch light ever since the telephone first rang. Why her? Why would a wealthy man she had never met, a man whose name meant nothing to her, leave her a locked room in his very last words on this earth? What could she possibly own that he had wanted? What could he possibly have kept that belonged to her? The road ended at last in a wide circle of pale gravel. And there it was. The house rose up out of the trees, tall and quiet, its many windows dark, its stone face streaked with the gentle wear of countless seasons of rain. It did not look frightening. That surprised her. It looked tired. It looked like a place that had been holding very still for a long time, like a house that had been waiting. Grace shut off the engine. For a long moment she simply sat there, listening to the wind move through the pines, listening to the tick of the cooling motor, listening to her own uneven heart. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the cold. She had not even reached the bottom of the wide stone steps when the great front door swung open on its own. An old man stood in the doorway. His suit was neat, pressed with obvious care, though it hung a little loose now over shoulders that the years had begun to round. His hair was silver, combed back from a lined and gentle face, and his eyes settled on her like a person looking at someone they have been expecting for a very, very long time. "Miss Bennett?" he said softly. "Grace is fine," she answered, and her own voice sounded small in all that quiet. The old man inclined his head, the smallest of bows. "My name is Walter," he said. "I have looked after this house for more years than I care to count." He did not move at once to bring her in out of the wind. Instead, he simply looked at her, not rudely, not with cold curiosity, but with something that came very close to sorrow. as if her face had reminded him of something he had spent a long while trying very hard not to think about. "You knew I was coming," Grace said. It was not quite a question. Walter's faint smile dimmed at the edges. "Yes." "How?" The old man hesitated. When he finally answered, his voice had dropped to something just above a whisper. "Because he believed you would come, long before you ever knew his name." A chill moved down through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Then Walter stepped aside and lifted one frail hand and gestured for her to come in out of the weather. Inside, the house seemed to be holding its breath. White sheets lay draped over the furniture like soft, patient ghosts. Dust hung suspended in the still air, lit to gold, where thin shafts of daylight slanted down through the tall windows. There was a smell of old wood and old paper, and something faintly sweet beneath it, like polish that had been worked into these floors for a lifetime, and then, one ordinary day, simply stopped. It did not feel abandoned. That was the strangest thing about it. It felt paused, as if everyone who lived here had only stepped out of the room a moment ago and might return at any second, and would be startled to find a stranger standing in their hall. Grace followed Walter down a long corridor. Their footsteps echoed softly on the stone floor. And as she walked, her eye caught something that made her slow her pace without quite meaning to. The walls. They were lined with pale, empty rectangles, squares and oblongs where the wallpaper had kept its color, each one ringed by the faded paper that had spent long years exposed to the light. There had been pictures hanging here once, a great many of them, and someone, at some point, had taken every last one of them down. "Were there paintings here?" Grace asked. Walter did not turn around. "There were." "What happened to them?" For a long moment, the old man said nothing at all. Their footsteps filled the silence. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he answered. "He took them down." "Why?" Walter's steps slowed. He seemed to choose each word with great care, handling them like something fragile. He said, "They reminded him of people he had not been able to help." The words settled over Grace like a gentle hand laid on her shoulder. People he had not been able to help. There was grief folded up inside that sentence. Old grief. The kind that does not really heal, but only learns, over the long years, to walk a little more quietly through the rooms of a person's heart. She did not understand it yet, but standing there in that hushed corridor, she felt it pass through her all the same. At the very end of the corridor stood a single wooden door, and unlike everything else in that aging house, it looked new. The wood was clean and pale. The brass handle gleamed in the dim light. There was no dust upon it, no scratches across its surface, none of the soft gray film that time had laid over the rest of the place. It sat there among all that quiet age like a single bright thread woven through an old gray cloth. And somehow, that was the most unsettling thing of all. Walter reached into his coat and drew out a key. It was old, heavy, worn dark, as though it had been held a great many times, and yet turned in its lock almost never. "This is the room he spoke of," the old man said. Grace stared down at the key in his palm. "No one has gone inside," she said. It was not a question this time. Walter shook his head slowly. "Not since it was locked away." "And how long ago was that?" The old man lifted his eyes to hers. "Near enough to your whole life, child." Grace felt the breath go thin and shallow in her chest. Her whole life, a room sealed shut and waiting in the heart of this silent house, for as long as she herself had walked upon the earth. Walter pressed the key into her open palm and folded her fingers gently around it. His hands were cool and dry, and they trembled just slightly. He left very clear instructions, Walter said. Only Grace Bennett. For a moment, the corridor seemed colder than it had been before. She looked down at the key, then up at the bright, clean door, then back at the old man who had stepped away now, giving her room, watching her like a person watches someone standing at the very edge of something they cannot yet see the bottom of. Part of her wanted to set the key down on the cold stone floor, to turn, to walk back down that long corridor, out through the heavy front door, into the gray and ordinary daylight, and drive away, and spend the rest of her days pretending the telephone had never rung at all. But there was another part of her, a small, stubborn, aching part that had spent a lifetime wondering who she was, where she had come from, whose face was hiding inside that faded little photograph in the silver heart against her chest. And that part of her stepped forward. She slid the key into the lock. For a single heartbeat, it resisted her. Then it turned. A soft click traveled down the length of the corridor, like a breath that had been held for years, finally let go. And the door swung slowly open. The room beyond was nothing like the things she had imagined on the long drive up. There was no fortune waiting inside, no gleaming stacks of money, no glass cases of treasure, no hidden gold catching the light, none of the things a frightened, hopeful heart conjures up in the dark. At first glance, it was almost ordinary. A large wooden desk stood near a cold stone fireplace. Shelves of books climbed the walls toward the high ceiling. A worn leather chair sat slightly turned, as though someone had just risen from it. A few plain boxes were stacked in the corners. The air inside was still, and a touch warmer than the corridor, and it smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old leather. The smell of a room where a person had spent a great many quiet hours alone. It did not feel like a vault. It felt like a place where someone had lived, as if a man had simply stood up from that chair one ordinary evening, walked out the door, and somehow never found his way back. Grace took one slow step inside, then another, and then her gaze lifted to the far wall, and her feet stopped moving altogether. The wall was covered in photographs, dozens of them, hundreds, frame beside frame beside frame, filling the space from the height of her knees to far above her head, layered and overlapping like the pages of a book that had been opened wide and never once closed. For a moment, her mind refused to make sense of what her eyes were showing her. She drifted closer, drawn forward almost against her will. The first photograph showed a little girl on a swing, small, dark-haired, a shy, careful smile on her face. The kind of smile worn by children who have already learned that smiling too widely can sometimes cost them something. Grace's hand rose slowly to her mouth. She knew that swing. She knew that little girl. It was her. Her fingers shook as she lifted the frame from its small nail on the wall. There was no mistake to be made. The same eyes. The same crooked front teeth she had eventually grown into. A photograph of herself. From a year so far back that she could barely remember the child standing inside it. She set it down with trembling hands and looked at the one beside it. A girl walking out through the doors of a school, a backpack far too big for her narrow shoulders. Her again. The next. A girl standing in an awkward line in a borrowed dress, waiting, head down, for her name to be called. Her again. And the next. A young woman behind a counter, tired around the eyes, pouring coffee in a place she had worked one long and lonely season of her life. Her. It was all her. Every single frame. Grace stepped back and her heart began to slam against the little silver heart that hung at her chest. Year by year. Moment by moment. A childhood she had spent believing that no one in the world was watching. A whole quiet life she had walked through, certain that she moved unseen, that she left no trace, that she could disappear and the world would not so much as pause. And here it was, pinned to a wall, in the locked and secret room of a dead man she had never once met. Someone had been there, in the doorways, across the gray streets, at the very edges of all those long and lonely afternoons she had believed she'd spent entirely alone. Someone had watched her grow from a frightened little girl into a quiet young woman, and she had never once felt their eyes upon her, and she had never, in all those years, learned their name. A cold wave moved slowly through her body, prickling along her arms, lifting the fine hairs at the back of her neck. She turned slowly toward the open door. Walter stood just outside the threshold. He had not followed her in. His face had gone pale and old and very, very tired. "Who took these?" Grace whispered. The old man's mouth opened, then closed. His gaze drifted past her, over the wall, over the hundreds of small, frozen pieces of a lonely life she had thought belonged to no one but herself. And something moved behind his eyes that looked almost unbearably like grief. "I think," he said quietly, "that you should sit down before you ask that question again." She did not sit down. She could not. Instead, she crossed to the desk, drawn there by something she could not have put into words, and on the desk, she found the box. It was wooden, plain, worn smooth at every corner by years and years of patient handling. Grace lifted the lid. Inside lay rows of envelopes, packed in close together, standing on their edges like small books arranged on a shelf. Dozens of them. She drew one out with careful fingers. The paper was soft with age. The ink upon it faded to a gentle gray, and on the front, written in a steady, careful hand, was a name, Grace Bennett, her own. She drew out another, the same name, and another, the same. Every envelope in the box had been addressed to her. Some of the paper had yellowed nearly to brown with the passing of long years. Some looked newer, the ink still dark and certain. She turned one over in her hands and found no stamp upon it, no postmark, no torn edge where it had ever been opened. Not one of them had been mailed. Not one of them had been sent. Someone had sat here, at this very desk, season after season after season, and written letters to a girl who would never be given them, and locked them all away inside a box, in a sealed room, to wait in the dark. Grace's eyes blurred and stung. She did not understand it. She understood only that the size of the thing was far too large for one chest to hold. Letters for nearly as long as she had been alive. A wall built out of stolen moments. A man who had watched over her from the shadows, and yet had never once stepped out into the light to let her see his face. Why? Why? At the very bottom of the box lay one final envelope. This one was different from all the rest. It had been sealed shut with a thick drop of dark blue wax, pressed flat and smooth and unbroken. Across the front, in that same careful hand, were a few short words. Open only after the room is found. And beneath them, a name. The name of the man who had brought her, at last, to this quiet house above the trees. Grace held the envelope for a long time. Her thumb traced the cool, hard ridge of the wax. Through the paper, she could feel the single folded page within, light as a fallen leaf. Behind her, Walter had finally come to the doorway, but he did not cross it. He simply waited there, an old man standing at the edge of a room full of another man's heart, watching the last chapter of a long, long story finally come due. Grace slid her thumb beneath the seal. The wax cracked with a small, dry sound. She drew out the page and began to unfold it, and then she went very still, because tucked behind the letter, pressed flat against the back of it where it had waited all this time, was something else. A small scrap of paper, old, brittle, folded into a tight little square and yellowed deep along every crease, worn the way paper goes when it has been held, and opened and folded again 1,000 times over by hands that simply could not bring themselves to throw it away. Grace set the letter gently aside, just for a moment, and carefully, so carefully, as though it might crumble into dust between her fingers, she opened the little square. It was a piece of an old printed page, the kind of page that quietly carries the small sorrows of a small town from one doorstep to the next. And there, near the center of it, half torn away, was a single faded line. A few words about a young woman. A young woman who had been lost from the world far too soon. A young woman whose passing, the line said, had been called an accident. Below the words sat a small, grainy picture. A face, soft eyes, a gentle, knowing smile. And there, at her throat, barely visible in the worn gray of that old image, a small silver heart on a thin chain. Grace's hand flew up to her own collar, to the warm metal resting there against her skin. The metal she had carried through every house, every borrowed bed, every lonely birthday, every candle, every wish whispered into the dark. The same heart, the same chain, the same woman, her mother. The room seemed to tilt gently around her. The wall of photographs, the box of unsent letters, the sealed words of a stranger who had loved her in secret. All of it spun slowly around the small torn page, trembling in her hands. Because the few words printed there, and the story Grace had been told as a child, and the quiet, settled certainty she had carried her whole life, that her mother had simply been taken by some cruel and ordinary accident on an empty stretch of road, no longer fit together at all. Something had been hidden. Something had been carried, quietly, for years, by the very man who had watched her grow. Something that began with a smiling young woman in a faded picture, and a silver heart, and a sentence pressed into soft metal, a sentence Grace had whispered to herself 1,000 times in the long dark of so many sleepless nights. No matter what happens, I will find my way back to you. She stood alone in the heart of that silent house. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft against the tall windows. The old man waited without a word in the doorway behind her. and for the first time in all her 25 years, Grace Bennett began to understand that the story she had been told about who she was and where she had come from and why she had been left so utterly alone in the world was only the very beginning of the truth. The letter waited in her hands like something alive. Grace set the small torn page down upon the desk very gently, the way you set down a sleeping child. Then she turned the folded letter over. The paper was soft and pale, worn thin along its creases, as though it had been written and unwritten, opened and closed, a great many times before it was finally sealed away in the dark. She drew one slow breath, and then she began to read. Dear Grace, if you are reading these words, then the time has come at last. And there is no longer any voice left to explain them but this one, set down in ink. For that, more than for anything else, there is sorrow. Her throat tightened around something she could not put a name to. She read on. There are things about your mother that were kept from you. Things she carried in silence. Things she gave a great deal to protect. And the first of them is this: she did not leave you. Grace's hand pressed flat against the desk to hold herself steady. 5 small words. She did not leave you. She had carried the opposite belief for so long that it had stopped feeling like a wound at all, and started feeling like a simple fact, like the color of her own eyes, like the sound of her own name. And now a dead man's careful hand was reaching across all those long gray years to tell her, gently, that she had been wrong about it the entire time. She read it once more, just to be certain the words would hold still on the page. She did not leave you. Then, slowly, she kept going. The letter spoke of a woman the man had once known. A woman with soft eyes and a stubborn heart. A woman whose name, written there in that careful, slanting hand, made the breath catch hard in Grace's chest. Margaret. Her mother. The man wrote of her like a person writes of someone they have spent long years trying very hard not to think about, because the thinking costs far too much, and the wound never quite scars over. He wrote that Margaret had been one of the bravest souls he had ever crossed paths with, that she had not been the fragile, unlucky woman the world had quietly decided she was, that somewhere along her short and shining life, she had come to see something she was not meant to see. The man did not say exactly what. He chose his words like a person crossing thin ice. Lightly, carefully, testing each one before he dared to set his weight upon it. He wrote only that there were powerful people in those quiet hills, people who hid their cruelty behind soft smiles and respectable names, people who had learned the oldest and ugliest lesson there is, that the easiest thing in all the world to take is something small and unguarded and unable to speak up for itself. And Margaret had decided, against every warning and all good sense, that someone ought to stand in their way. Your mother was not afraid of much, the letter said, but near the end she grew afraid of one thing. She grew afraid for you. Grace lowered the page to her lap. She found that her eyes had filled, and that she had not even felt them do it. Outside, the rain went on against the tall windows, soft and steady, like a patient hand patting a small back somewhere in the dark. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist, the way she had taught herself to do as a child, quickly, quietly, so that no one would see and no one would ask. But there was no one here to see, and still the old habit held. After a moment, she lifted the letter once more. 3 nights before the world lost her, the man had written, "Margaret came to this house. She was frightened, not for herself. She had given up being frightened for herself a long time before. She was frightened for the little girl she was leaving behind every morning to go and do dangerous work. That night, she asked one single thing of me. She asked that if anything should happen to her, someone would watch over you, that someone would make certain you were never truly alone in this world, even on the nights when it would feel as though you were." And a promise was given. Grace stopped. Her gaze drifted slowly away from the page and rose toward the far wall, toward the hundreds of photographs, the little girl on the swing, the girl with the too big backpack, the tired young woman behind a counter pouring coffee on a long and lonely afternoon. And all at once, the wall changed. It did not change at all, of course. Every frame hung exactly where it had hung a moment before. But something behind Grace's eyes shifted, the way a whole room changes when a single lamp is lit in the corner. And what, only minutes ago, had looked like a thing to be feared, now looked like something else entirely. Not surveillance, not the cold, patient gaze of a stranger lurking at the edges of her days. A promise kept season after season after season, in the only way left to a man who could not show his face. He had not been watching her. He had been watching over her. There is a great and tender distance between those two things, and in the space of one shaking breath, Grace crossed all of it. She rose from the desk. Her legs felt strange beneath her, light and unsteady, as though the floor itself had quietly tilted while she sat there reading. She crossed slowly to the wall, and this time, she truly looked. At the little girl on the swing, she saw a child who had not been forgotten after all. At the girl in the borrowed dress, head bowed, waiting for her name to be called, she saw a girl who had not, in truth, been moving through the world unseen. At the young woman behind the counter, tired and alone in the gray hours of an afternoon, she saw someone who had been carried in a stranger's heart through every ordinary moment of a life she had believed no one was paying any mind to. The tears slid down her face now, and she let them fall. There was no one to hide them from. And besides, they were not the kind of tears she had wept as a child, alone in narrow beds in other people's houses. These were not the tears of a girl who had been left behind. These were the tears of a woman discovering, far later than she ever should have, that she had been loved the entire time, and had simply never learned how to see it. She reached out and touched the edge of one frame, the little girl on the swing, her own small face, looking back at her across all those years. "He never stopped," a quiet voice said from the doorway. Grace turned. Walter stood there still, his old hands folded before him, his eyes wet in the soft lamplight. "Whatever else you come to learn about him inside this room," the old man said, "you ought to hear this part from someone who was here to see it. He never once stopped, not in all the long years." Grace looked at him for a moment. "You knew," she said softly, "all of it." Walter's gaze dropped. "I knew enough to carry it," he answered, "and little enough to sleep at night." He saw to that. Then he stepped back into the shadow of the hall and left her alone again with the wall and the box, and the truth that was still unfolding. Grace returned to the desk. There was more to the wooden box, she discovered, than the rows of letters. Beneath the close-packed envelopes, pressed flat against the very bottom, lay a stack of plain-bound notebooks. Their covers were worn soft as cloth. Their pages were thick with that close, slanting hand she had already begun to know the way you come to know a voice. She lifted the first one and opened it across her knees. These were not letters meant for her. These were the private pages of a man speaking to no one at all but himself. And they were so much heavier than the letters had been. The early pages were careful, measured. The thoughts of a man holding the whole world at a polite and comfortable arm's length. But as the seasons turned within them, the writing began to change. It grew closer, rawer. The neat, even lines began to lean and crowd against one another. The way handwriting does when a person stops writing for any eyes but their own, and begins simply trying to get the weight out of their chest before it crushes them altogether. Margaret's name began to appear, again and again. And around her name, slowly, a second story took shape. One Grace had to read between the lines to truly understand. The man had not always been a kind one. That was the first thing those pages confessed. There had been a long stretch of his life he was not proud of. A time when he had stood comfortably among the very people Margaret would one day set herself against. A time when he had looked the other way, because looking the other way was the easy thing, and because the small and unguarded sufferings around him had not seemed, from where he stood, to be any of his concern. He did not soften it. That was the strange grace of those pages. He did not paint himself as a good man tricked into wrongdoing. He did not reach for excuses. He wrote it plainly, like a person finally confessing a thing they have carried so long that the carrying has become a kind of slow penance all its own. He had been one of them, once. Grace stopped reading. The notebook lay open and heavy across her knees, and for one cold moment, the warmth she had felt only minutes before, the soft, aching tenderness of being loved by a watchful stranger, curdled into something darker. Because if the man had truly once stood among those people, then what was all of this? The wall behind her, the box before her, the letters, the patient promise. Was it the gentle work of a good soul, or only the long, slow penance of a guilty one, buying back his own sleep one stolen photograph at a time? She sat very still. She felt Walter somewhere out in the hall, near but unseen, and she was grateful that he said nothing. He seemed to understand that this was a place no one could walk for her, so Grace did the one thing she truly knew how to do, the thing she did with every broken piece that ever came into her hands. She did not throw it away in disgust. She did not decide all at once that it was beyond saving. She kept reading and looked, as she had learned to look, for the good wood hidden beneath the damage. The pages told the rest of it slowly. There had been a night. The man wrote of it more than once, returning to it again and again, like a tongue returning to a sore tooth, unable to leave it be. A night when Margaret had come to him, not to accuse him, not to shame him for the man he had been. She had come, of all things, to ask for his help. She had looked at this comfortable, compromised man, a man she had every reason to count among her quiet enemies, and she had somehow seen in him a thing that even he had long since stopped believing was still there. "She did not ask me to be brave," he had written. "She asked me to be better." As though it were a simple thing. As though it were still within my reach. No one had spoken to me in such a way in a great many years, and something inside me, which I had believed long dead and buried, turned over in its sleep. Grace read the line twice. Something inside him, long dead, turning over in its sleep. She thought of the chairs in her workshop, the tables other people had given up on, the water-stained dressers carried in by owners who had already, in their hearts, said goodbye to them, the good wood waiting silently under all that ruin for hands patient enough to come and find it. She thought that her mother must have had hands a little like that, not for furniture, for people, for the ones the world had quietly decided were finished. He had changed after that night. The pages made it plain. It had not been sudden, and it had not been clean, and it had not been easy. A man does not undo years of looking the other way in the space of a single evening. But he had begun, quietly, at first only by listening when Margaret spoke, instead of letting his eyes slide away to something more comfortable. Then by remembering things he had spent a long time teaching himself to forget. Then, at last, late, far too late, and knowing all the while that it was too late, by deciding that he would help her stand in the path of the very people he had once stood beside. And then the pages broke. Grace turned a leaf and found a single line set alone in the middle of a wide and empty page, the ink pressed so hard in places that it had torn clean through the paper. "Margaret is gone." 3 words, nothing more. The pages that followed were blank. One, then another, then more, pale and untouched, as though the man had opened the notebook night after night, and found that there was nothing left in him to set down. A long, terrible silence, written in empty paper. When the writing finally began again, the hand had changed. It was older, heavier, the hand of a man who had crossed some line deep inside himself, and come out the other side as someone else entirely. "I came to her too late to save her," he had written. "That is a weight no fortune in this world has been able to lift from these shoulders. But there is a child, and to the child, at the very least, the promise can still be kept." Grace closed the notebook. For a long moment, she simply held it against her chest, the way she had held the silver heart on so many sleepless nights of her childhood. The man who had brought her here was not a saint. She understood that now. He had been weak, once, in the way that comfortable people are so often weak. Not cruel, exactly, only unwilling. Unwilling to see, unwilling to be troubled by another person's pain. And then a brave woman had looked him square in the eye and asked him, simply, to be better. And he had spent the whole rest of his days trying to become the man she had believed he could be. He had not done it for thanks. There had been no thanks waiting for him. The one person whose forgiveness he wanted had been taken from the world before he ever had the chance to earn it. He had done it for a promise, and for a little girl on a swing, who never once knew that he was there. The wall of photographs was not the work of a stranger, and it was not, in the end, the cold ledger of a guilty conscience either. It was something far more human than either of those things. It was a man's entire second life, spent quietly watching over the one piece of his own redemption that he had ever been allowed to keep. Her. Grace looked around the room with new eyes. The desk where he had written letters that would never be sent. The chair where he had sat season after season beneath the weight of a promise made too late and kept too long. The fireplace, gone cold. The books, the deep and waiting quiet of the place. It was not a crime scene. It was not a vault. It was a kind of grave a man had built for himself while he still drew breath. A place where he could keep the truth safe and keep his watch and wait for the one person in all the world he had any right to hand it to. And here, in the very heart of it, sat the thing that had begun to bloom in Grace's chest the moment she read those 5 small words. She did not leave you. For her whole life, Grace had carried a quiet question she had been far too ashamed to say aloud. Even alone, even to herself. A small, sharp, secret thing, hidden away where no one could find it. Why wasn't I enough? Why hadn't her mother stayed? Why hadn't she held on a little tighter, fought a little harder, found some way, any way, to come back through the door one ordinary evening? It was a cruel question. It had sat at the bottom of her like a cold stone all those years, coloring the way she looked at every door that ever closed and every person who ever walked away from her. And now, at last, the answer was here, written in 2 hands. Her mother's brave, short life, and a guilty man's long grief. Her mother had not chosen to go. Her mother had been taken in the very middle of doing something brave, something that had placed her own small daughter's safety far above her own next breath. It was a difference that changed everything. The whole shape of Grace's childhood quietly rearranged itself, there in that lamplit room, over the course of a single afternoon and a single rainy night. She was not the daughter a mother had abandoned. She was the daughter a mother had fought for. And there is a whole world of distance between those 2 girls. Grace had spent 25 years being the first of them. She felt, sitting in that quiet room, the first trembling beginnings of becoming the second. The tears came again, but this time they were strange to her and unfamiliar, and they frightened her a little, because they were not tears of grief. They were tears of pride. Pride for a woman she could not even remember. Pride in the soft-eyed stranger from inside the silver heart, who had turned out, against all of it, to carry a spine of iron. Pride that somehow, against everything the years had done to her, a little of that same iron might be folded away inside her own quiet chest, waiting, the way the good wood waits beneath the ruin. She reached up and closed her hand around the small silver heart. For her whole life, it had meant one thing only: loss. A reminder of all she did not have. A small locket full of everything that had ever been taken from her, now held tight in her fist in that warm circle of lamplight. It meant something else. It was proof. Proof that the woman in the faded picture had been real. Proof that she had loved her daughter enough to be afraid for her. Proof that Grace's story had not begun in a borrowed bed in a stranger's house, but long before that, in the arms of someone who had whispered into her small ear that she would find her way back. No matter what happens, I will find my way back to you. And in a way the woman could never have foreseen, through a guilty man and a wall of photographs and a box of letters that were never sent. She had. It was full dark when Grace finally set the last notebook aside. The rain had eased to a soft whisper against the glass. The little lamp on the desk threw a warm circle of gold across the scattered papers, and beyond its edges, the room fell away into deep and gentle shadow. Walter had brought her something hot to drink at some point in the long evening, and set it quietly at her elbow, and slipped away again without a word. The cup had long since gone cold. She did not remember lifting it once. She felt hollowed out, and yet, somehow, more full than she had been in many years, as though something heavy had been carefully lifted away from her, and something quiet and warm had been set down in the empty place where it had been. She thought she might sleep if she let herself. She thought, for the first time in a long while, that she might even sleep well. And then her eye fell upon the last notebook, the final one in the stack. She had nearly missed it entirely, tucked away beneath the others, its cover a shade darker than the rest, as though it had been meant to lie a little hidden. She lifted it onto her knees and opened it to the last page that bore any writing at all. The hand here was the oldest of them all, slow, trembling. The hand of a man very near the end of a long and weary road. And what it said made the warmth begin to drain, slowly, out of her chest. I had hoped, by now, to be able to write that it was finished, that those who took so much had been made at last to answer for it, that the quiet hills had been made safe again, and the small unguarded things within them could grow up unafraid. That is not what these hands are able to write. Grace's pulse began to climb. Not all of them are gone. The old hand had set down. Time has carried most of them away, one by one, but one remains. One who was clever and patient and careful beyond the rest, and who has spent these long years standing close enough to keep his watch on me, in much the same way that I have kept mine on you. If you have opened this room, then he knows that it has been opened, and he knows now that you are here. The notebook trembled in her hands. She read the final lines slowly, as though slowing down might somehow change what they said. Be careful, child, of the kindest face you meet. Those who learn to hide cruelty behind a soft smile have had a great deal of practice at it, and the one who is left has had more practice than any of them. The lamp seemed, all at once, to give off a good deal less warmth than it had only a moment before. Grace lowered the notebook to her lap. The house was very quiet around her, too quiet, perhaps. She lifted her eyes slowly toward the doorway, half expecting to find Walter standing there, with his folded hands and his sorrowful old gaze. But the doorway was empty. The long corridor beyond it stretched away into the dark, lined on both sides with all those pale and empty squares where the pictures used to hang. And somewhere out there, beyond the rain and the pines and the long winding road through the trees, someone, she understood now, was no longer simply a name in an old man's letter. Someone was still walking the quiet hills her mother had given everything to make safe. Someone with a soft smile and a patient heart and a great deal left to lose. Someone who had only just learned that the locked room had finally been opened by the very girl her mother had died to protect. The past, Grace realized, as a slow chill settled over her in that fading circle of lamplight, was not finished with her at all. It had only been waiting, the same way the room had waited, the same way the letters had waited year upon year in their wooden box, and the same way, somewhere far out in the dark, a soft and patient smile was waiting still. For her. Morning came gray and gentle to the house above the trees. Grace had not gone home. Somewhere in the small, quiet hours, exhaustion had finally folded her down into the worn leather chair beside the cold fireplace. And she had slept there, the last notebook still resting open across her lap, the lamp burning low beside her. When she woke, the wick had nearly gone out. The rain had stopped in the night, and a thin, pale light was leaning in through the tall windows, falling across the wall of photographs, touching each small frame in its turn, the way sunrise touches the headstones in a quiet churchyard. For one soft moment, she did not remember where she was. Then she did, and the memory of it arrived all at once. The letter, the wooden box, the long confession written in a dead man's trembling hand, and those final lines that had followed her down into uneasy sleep. Be careful, child, of the kindest face you meet. Grace sat very still in the gray light. She did not feel like the woman who had driven up that winding road only the morning before. That woman had been certain she was alone in the world. She had carried that certainty like an old coat, worn so long that you forget you have it on. This woman, waking stiff and quiet in a stranger's chair, was no longer quite so sure. And there is a particular kind of fear that comes with that, the fear of hoping. She found Walter in the great kitchen at the back of the house. He was standing at a window, watching the mist lift slowly off the pines, a cup cooling forgotten in his hand. He had made coffee. 2 cups, she noticed, as though he had known, without being told, that she would not have slipped away in the night. You stayed, he said, without turning around. I couldn't go, Grace answered. The old man nodded slowly, as if that were the only sensible thing a person could have said. He set a cup in front of her at the long wooden table. His hand trembled as he did it, the same small tremble she had seen at the front door, and again on the heavy key. There is something you ought to know, Walter said, before this day goes any further. He lowered himself into a chair across from her, careful with his old bones, and the morning light caught the deep lines that the years had cut into his face. You are not the only one who loved your mother, he said. Grace went still over her cup. There is a woman who knew her, Walter went on. Knew her before, when Margaret was young and bright and not yet afraid of anything in this world. A faint, sad warmth touched his voice. She has been waiting a great deal longer than you have, child. Waiting for someone to walk back through that door who remembered, who carried even a little of Margaret in them. She's alive, Grace said. It came out half a question, half a prayer. She is, said Walter, old now, slower than she was. Her eyes have begun to fail her. He smiled. But her heart and her memory are as clear as a struck bell, and there is no one in these hills who loved your mother better, save the woman who gave her life to you. He set his cup down. Her name, he said, is Ruth. Ruth arrived a little after the mist had cleared from the road. She came up the long gravel drive in an old, well-kept car, driving slow, at the careful, deliberate pace of someone whose eyes are no longer what they were, but whose pride will never quite let her say so out loud. Grace watched from the wide stone steps as the car came to a stop. The door opened, And the woman who climbed out was small and silver-haired and dressed with the quiet, particular care of a person who has spent a long lifetime learning how to make very little look like a great deal. Ruth straightened. She steadied herself against the car for a breath. Then she began to cross the gravel toward the house, and halfway there, she stopped. She looked up at the young woman standing on the steps, and her face simply broke open, not with grief, with recognition. "Oh," Ruth said softly, "just that." One small word, carried up the steps on a breath that shook in the cool air. "Oh, child, you have her face." And Grace, who had spent her whole life being looked at by strangers as though she were nobody in particular, as though she were furniture in someone else's room, stood there on the steps of that great quiet house and felt herself be seen, truly seen, for what may have been the first time she could remember. Her own eyes filled before she could think to stop them. She did not try to wipe them away this time. They sat together in the front room where Walter had drawn the white sheets off 2 chairs and let the morning pour in across the floor. Ruth held Grace's hands across the small space between them. The old woman's hands were thin and spotted with the years, and cool to the touch. But the grip in them was strong, warm, certain in a way that made something in Grace's chest ache. "She would speak of you," Ruth said, "in the last while, when she had grown frightened, and would not say of what." The old woman's thumb moved gently over the back of Grace's hand. "She kept her troubles close, your mother. She did not want them landing on the people she loved. That was her way." "You knew her well," Grace said. "As well as she let anyone," Ruth answered with a small, sad smile, "which was less than those of us who loved her would have liked." Her gaze drifted far away into some sunlit afternoon long gone from the world. "But she could not hide the way she loved you. That she could not have hidden if she tried for 100 years. It was in everything. The way she said your name, the way she watched the door, the way she went so still sometimes in the middle of a sentence, like she was listening for you from across a great distance." Grace looked down at their joined hands. "Everyone told me she left," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she had meant it to. "That she was just gone, an accident, a patch of bad luck on an empty road. That was the whole of the story they ever gave me." Ruth's grip tightened around her fingers. "That was the story they let stand," the old woman said quietly, "because the true one frightened them far too much to say out loud." Grace lifted her eyes. "Frightened who?" And for the first time, something passed across Ruth's gentle face that was not gentle at all. A shadow, old and careful and watchful. The look of a woman who has spent a long life knowing things she was never able to safely speak. "There were people in these hills," Ruth said slowly, "who were very comfortable, very respected, and your mother began, little by little, to make them less so." The old woman glanced toward the window, toward the long road winding down into the trees. "Comfortable people will do a great deal to stay comfortable, more than you would ever guess to look at them across a church pew. And the worst of them," her mouth thinned, "the worst of them smile the whole time they do it." Grace went very still in her chair. "The kindest face you meet. Some of those people are gone now," Ruth went on. "Time takes everyone in the end, the wicked along with the rest of us. She paused, and her eyes sharpened. But not all of them. There is one I have kept an eye on all these long years, one who landed soft, one who turned respectable and well-liked, and trusted by everyone who matters. Her voice dropped. The sort of man people are honestly glad to shake hands with. The sort no one would ever believe a word against. The room had grown very quiet. "Do you know his name?" Grace asked. Ruth looked at her for a long, measuring moment, and then, gently, like a person finally setting down something heavy they have carried much too far, she said it. The name landed softly in the still room, and it took Grace a moment to understand why hearing it made the floor seem to tilt beneath her chair. Because she knew it. She had heard it spoken in a careful, polished voice on a gray and ordinary morning, coming out of her own telephone in her own small rented room. The attorney, the man who had read her own name aloud out of a dead man's will and told her she had inherited a single locked room. Edward Vance, the man who had brought her here. "No," Grace said, almost a whisper. "He's the one handling everything. He's the one who found me. He's the whole reason I'm sitting in this house at all." Ruth's face did not change. "Yes," the old woman said, very evenly. "I imagine he is." And the quiet, knowing way she said it was somehow worse than any shout could have been. It came together slowly inside Grace's mind, the way the worst truths always seem to. The man had telephoned her himself. He had not sent a letter. He had not let some clerk make the call. He had reached out, in person, with all that careful warmth, and guided her, step by gentle step, up the long, winding road to the one door in all the world that held the truth about her mother. A truth a wiser enemy would have wanted buried beyond finding. Unless he had needed it found. Unless he had needed the room opened, and could not be the one to open it. The will had named her, and her alone. And Walter, who held the only key, would never have turned it for anyone else. A guilty soul, near his end, had built a trap his enemy could not spring alone. Vance could not be seen forcing that door, not without showing the whole town exactly what he was. He needed Grace to open it, willingly, and then to sign it all quietly away, so that whatever waited behind it could disappear without a single question ever being asked. And she had nearly let him. She had nearly read it all, and wept her fill, and gone home, and let the kind man on the telephone handle every last detail, the way she had let people handle everything, her whole life long. "He will come today," Walter said quietly. He had come to stand in the doorway of the front room, an old man with an old man's long instinct for trouble coming up the road. "He has been telephoning the house since yesterday evening," the old man went on, "asking how you are settling in, asking, ever so gently, whether you have finished looking through things, asking when the house might be cleared, and the whole matter put to rest." Grace looked up at him. "Cleared," she repeated. "It is the way these things are done, he tells me." Walter's voice was flat with something that was not quite belief. "The estate is to be settled, the contents disposed of, soon. He has been most helpful in arranging all of it." A pause. He seemed especially keen that the room not be left as it is for very long. Grace rose slowly to her feet. The wall of photographs. The wooden box of unsent letters. The notebooks, the confession, the small torn page, the only proof left in all the world of who her mother had truly been, and what had truly become of her. All of it. Cleared away. Disposed of. Gone before any living eye but Grace's own had ever been allowed to rest upon it. And she had come within a breath of letting it happen. "No," Grace said. The word came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Ruth looked up at her from her chair, and the old woman smiled. "There she is," Ruth murmured, almost too soft to hear. "There's her mother's girl." He arrived in the early afternoon. Grace heard the car before she saw it. A smooth, low, unhurried sound on the gravel. The sound of a man who has rarely in his life had any reason to hurry. Through the front window, she watched him climb out. Edward Vance was younger than she had pictured him from his voice. Well-dressed, easy in every movement. He paused a moment in the gravel circle to look up at the great, quiet house. And there was something in the way he looked at it. Something patient, something almost fond, something that said, "This will all be settled soon," and settled my way, that lifted the fine hairs along Grace's arms. Then he came up the steps. Walter let him in, and the careful, polished voice from the telephone filled the front hall like warm water filling a basin. "Miss Bennet," he took her hand in both of his. "I'm so glad you stayed. I confess I worried it would all be too much for you." Such a strange thing the old man asked in the end. A young woman, all the way out here, all alone, with no one to lean on. His hands were soft. His smile was kind. It was a very good smile. And Grace understood, looking straight into it, exactly how a person could spend a whole lifetime hiding behind such a thing, and have no one ever once think to look behind it. "It wasn't too much," she said. "No?" He released her hand and let his gaze travel, lightly, easily, down the long corridor toward the bright, clean door at its far end. "You've had a proper look around, then, at the room." "I have. And?" The smile held. Only his eyes moved, quick and sharp, just for a heartbeat. "I'll admit, I've always wondered." He was so terribly secretive about it. All those years locked away. A small, indulgent laugh. Probably nothing in there but a sad and lonely man's clutter, in the end. They hold on to the strangest things, the lonely ones. Old papers. Old grudges. "It wasn't clutter," Grace said. Something flickered behind the smile. "Wasn't it?" he said. Ruth came in from the front room then, slow, deliberate, leaning on nothing but her own quiet certainty. And the moment Edward Vance saw her, the warmth went out of the room the way heat rushes out of a house when a door is left standing open in winter. The two of them looked at one another across the front hall. An old woman who remembered everything, and a man who had spent a great many years and a great deal of charm, making certain that no one ever would. "Ruth," he said. The name came out flatter now, careful, stripped of its warmth. "I didn't know you were still about." "I'm sure you didn't," Ruth said pleasantly. "You stopped looking my way a long time ago. I was beneath your noticing." She lowered herself into a chair, unhurried, settling in like a woman who had not the slightest intention of leaving. "It is a great gift, you know, being beneath a man's notice. You see a remarkable amount from down there. Far more than people like you ever imagine." The smile on Vance's face had become a thing held in place by effort alone. He turned back to Grace, and when he spoke again, the warmth had returned to his voice. But it had changed underneath. It had a floor to it now, a hard bottom you could feel through the soft surface of the words, Grace. He spread his soft hands wide, the very picture of a reasonable man. Let me be honest with you, because I believe you deserve honesty. There are things in that room that could hurt people, good people, people with families, with names, with whole lives built up over many years. He shook his head, sorrowful. An old, bitter man, alone at the end of his days, scribbling accusations in the dark. That isn't truth, my dear. It's the last spite of a guilty conscience trying to drag others down into the grave with him. He was not a good man. I think you've gathered that much by now. I learned that he tried to become one, Grace said. Late, but he tried. Vance's jaw tightened just slightly. Let me handle the room, he said, gentler now, coaxing, like a man coaxing a frightened animal toward an open cage. Let me take all of that weight off your shoulders. You came out here looking for family, didn't you? For belonging? You won't find it in a dead man's dusty boxes, Grace. You'll find it in a fresh start. He let the words settle into the quiet. There is a great deal of money in this estate, a very great deal, and the man left a fair portion of it within reach of whoever helps. Close things out cleanly, quietly, sensibly. The smile again, soft and patient. That could be you. You could walk out of this house a different woman entirely from the frightened one who walked in. No more lonely rooms, no more borrowed beds, no more wondering whether anyone in the world remembers your name. Just let me clear the room, sign where I show you, and let the past stay quietly where it belongs. It was, Grace thought, a very good offer. It was, in truth, nearly everything the girl with the cupcake and the single guttering candle had ever wished for. A way out, a way up, a door that someone was finally holding open for her, and all she had to do to walk through it was let go of the only thing in all the world that proved her mother had loved her. She thought of the chairs in her workshop, the broken ones, the ones other people had given up on and hauled to the curb. She thought of all the long, patient hours she had spent finding the good wood beneath the ruin, because some stubborn, quiet part of her had never once been able to call a thing worthless, simply because it had been damaged or discarded or left behind. She thought of her mother, a woman who had looked straight into this man's whole rotten, comfortable world and refused to call it hopeless, and tried, against all good sense, to mend it, and given everything she had to the trying. And Grace thought that she had not driven all the way up that long and winding road to become the kind of woman who signs where she is shown and looks away, and lets the comfortable people stay comfortable. No, Grace said. The word was very quiet. It was, perhaps, the loudest thing she had said in all of her 25 years. The smile slid off Edward Vance's face at last, and what lay underneath it was not kind at all. You don't understand what you're holding on to, he said. The warmth was gone now, entirely. The voice had dropped low and flat and cold, and the soft hands had curled into something tighter at his sides. Sentiment, he said. That is all you have in that room. The ravings of a man who hated me because I had everything he wanted, and a clear conscience besides. He took a step closer to her. There is nothing in there that proves a single thing. Nothing any sensible soul would ever believe. An old fool's diary, A wall of stolen photographs that will have the whole county thinking he was a madman, not a saint. His lip curled. You drag all that out into the daylight, and you know who they'll end up pitying. Not your precious mother. You. The strange little orphan, chasing ghosts up and down these hills, making a spectacle of herself over a man she never even met. Grace felt the old fear rise up in her, the fear that had kept her small her whole life, the fear that whispered, "He's right. You're nobody. Who in the world would ever believe a girl like you?" She had felt that fear in 8 different houses. She had felt it on every lonely birthday. She had felt it and obeyed it for as long as she could remember being alive. But she was not standing alone this time. Ruth was in the chair just behind her, silver-haired and entirely unafraid. Walter was in the doorway, his old hands no longer trembling at all. And down the long corridor, on the wall at its end, hundreds of small frames held the steady, patient proof that a girl who had spent her life believing herself unseen had, in truth, been watched over with love through every gray and ordinary day of it. "You're right that I don't have much," Grace said. Her voice shook, and she let it shake. "I've never had much. I know exactly how little a girl like me is worth in a room like this." She lifted her chin. "But you're forgetting something, Mr. Vance." "Am I?" "You came all this way to get into that room," Grace said. "You needed it opened, and the only person in all the world who could open it was me." The silence that followed was complete. "He knew," she said softly, hearing the truth of it become clear even as the words left her. "The man you hated. He knew you would come looking one day. He knew you'd need someone to open the door for you. So he made certain that the one person who could was the one person you could never buy, and never frighten, and never charm into letting go." Her eyes filled, but she did not look away from him. "The daughter of the woman you couldn't silence." Edward Vance stared at her, and for the first time since his car had come smoothly up the gravel, the patient man looked afraid. It was Ruth who finally broke the silence. The old woman rose slowly from her chair and crossed the room, and she did not so much as glance at Edward Vance. She looked instead at the silver heart resting against Grace's collar. "May I, child?" Ruth asked gently. Grace's hand rose to the locket without thought, the old protective habit of a lifetime, the reflex of a girl who had learned to guard the one thing that was truly hers. Then, slowly, she let her hand fall away. Ruth lifted the small silver heart in her thin fingers and turned it toward the light from the window. "She wore this every day," the old woman murmured. "I remember it well, even when it had long gone out of fashion, even when finer things were laid before her." A soft, sad smile touched her mouth. She used to say it held everything that mattered to her in this world. Ruth pressed the tiny, worn hinge. The locket opened with a small, familiar click. And there was the faded ghost of the photograph Grace had looked upon 10,000 times in the dark. But Ruth did not look at the photograph. Ruth looked behind it. Her thumb moved against the worn old metal, gently, knowingly, pressing at a place where you already feel, beneath your fingertip, that something has been hidden. And the faded photograph lifted just slightly at one corner. Behind it, pressed flat into the back of the silver heart, so small, so thin, that no careless eye would have found it in 100 years of looking, was a key. A tiny key. Old. Plain. The kind of key that opens nothing grand at all, only something small and private, and dearly, dearly kept. Grace stared at it. She had carried it against her own heartbeat all her life, through 8 houses, through every lonely birthday, through every wish she had ever whispered into the dark. Her mother had hidden it in the one place no one would ever think to look, in plain sight, pressed against the chest of the one person in all the world she trusted to keep it safe. The one person she had spent her final frightened days trying so hard to protect. The one person she had promised, against everything, to find her way back to. "She gave it to you," Ruth whispered, the way a mother gives a thing, without a word of explanation, trusting that you'd keep it close to you until the very day you needed it. Across the room, Edward Vance had gone very pale indeed, because a key is only frightening to a man who knows, somewhere deep in his soul, that there is a lock waiting out there in the world. A lock he has spent his whole comfortable life praying would never, ever be opened. "That doesn't belong to you," Vance said. His voice cracked clean down the middle of it. He took a step forward, his soft hand reaching out, and for one bare moment, the patient, respectable mask fell away entirely. And what lay underneath was only a frightened, grasping thing that had been hiding in plain sight for a lifetime, dressed up in good suits and warm handshakes. Walter moved into the room. He was old and bent and slow, but he stepped between Edward Vance and the girl, and he did not move from that spot. And there was something in the old man's deep and steady quiet that stopped Vance where he stood, with his soft hand still half raised in the air. "You should go now," Walter said. "Just that." "You have no business here," Vance snapped, but the bluster had gone thin and reedy. "This estate is not settled. I am the executor. I have every legal right to—" "You have the right to leave," Ruth said pleasantly, from beside Grace. "While leaving is still the simplest thing anyone in this room is going to ask of you." She folded her thin hands together. "You forget yourself, Edward. You've spent so many years being the only one left who remembered the truth that you came to believe you were safe inside it, hidden, untouchable." Her eyes did not waver from his face for so much as an instant. "You are not. Not any longer. There are 3 of us standing in this hall now, and the girl is holding the key." For a long, long moment, no one moved at all. The kind face, the patient smile, the careful, polished voice, all of it was gone. What stood in that front hall now was simply a man who had built his entire comfortable life upon the certainty that no one was watching, and no one would remember, and no one would ever come climbing up that long road to look. And he had just learned, all at once, that he had been wrong on every single count. He left without another word. The smooth, low sound of his car faded slowly back down the gravel drive, into the trees, into the pale gray afternoon, until at last the house was quiet once more. Grace sat down slowly. Her legs had gone weak beneath her. Now that there was no longer anyone left in the room, she had to be strong in front of. She opened her hand and looked down at the tiny key resting in her palm. So small, so light, carried so close, for so long. and never once known to be there. I had it the whole time, she said quietly. Everything I ever wanted to know about her. I carried a piece of it pressed against my own heart every single day of my life, and I never even knew that it was there. Ruth lowered herself into the chair beside her and took Grace's free hand in both of her own. That is the way of it, child, the old woman said gently. We carry far more than we know. The ones who truly love us. They tuck things away inside of us. Small things, quiet things, and we go years and years believing we are empty, believing we are alone in the world, never once knowing what has been hidden away so close, just waiting, patient as anything, for the day we are finally ready to find it. Grace closed her fingers around the little key. She thought of the wall of photographs. She thought of the box of letters that were never sent. She thought of a brave young woman who had hidden a key against the heart of a sleeping child and trusted the long years to keep it safe until that child was grown enough and strong enough to turn it. She did not feel like an orphan sitting there in the fading afternoon light. She did not feel forgotten. She felt chosen, trusted, loved, across a distance that not even death itself had been able to close. There's a lock somewhere, Grace said softly. She lifted her eyes toward the long corridor, toward the bright, clean door at its far end, toward the quiet room where a flawed and sorry man had spent the whole of his second life keeping a promise made too late. Somewhere in that room, she said, there is a lock that fits this key. Ruth squeezed her hand. Walter, in the doorway, slowly nodded his old head, and outside, for the first time since Grace Bennett had driven up that long and winding road through the pines, the gray afternoon sky was beginning, just at its very edges, to break softly open into light. The light came back into the house slowly, the way warmth returns to a hand that has been out too long in the cold. For a long while after the sound of Edward Vance's car had faded down through the trees, no one in the front hall said a word. Grace sat with the tiny key cupped in both her hands, shielding it the way you shield a small flame against the wind. Ruth stayed close beside her, near enough that their shoulders touched, and Walter stood where he had stood between the girl and the danger. An old man who had found, somewhere deep inside himself, one last act of standing firm. Then, gently, the afternoon sun pushed through the last of the gray. It came in low through the tall windows. It crossed the floor in long, warm bands. It reached the far end of the corridor and touched the bright, clean door and lay golden across the worn old boards, as though the house itself had finally let out a breath it had been holding for the better part of a lifetime. Grace lifted her head. There's a lock somewhere in that room, she said again, very quietly. I have to find it. But before she could rise from the chair, Walter spoke. Wait, the old man said. Before you go back in there, child, there is one more thing you need to hear, and it ought to come from me. It ought to have come from me a long while ago. Something in his voice made her go still. It was not the careful, sorrowful voice he had used at the front door. It was lower than that, heavier, the voice of a man setting down a stone he had carried so long that his whole life had bent itself around the shape of it. Walter crossed slowly to the wall of photographs. He stood before it a moment, this old man in his neat, pressed suit, looking up at the hundreds of small frames, at the little girl on the swing, at the child with the too big backpack, at the tired young woman behind the counter, pouring coffee on a long and lonely afternoon. And then he reached up and laid one trembling hand against the very first frame, the girl on the swing. "Do you know," he said softly, without turning around, "what it is to watch a child grow up? From a distance you are never once permitted to close." Grace did not answer. She could not, because something in her had already begun to understand, a breath before her mind would let her shape the words. "He could not do it himself," Walter went on, still gazing up at the wall. "You understand that much now." He could not show his face. There were eyes on him all those years. The wrong sort of eyes. The old man's voice thickened. "The man who is gone could not so much as drive slowly past your schoolyard without someone, somewhere, taking quiet note of it. He knew that. It near broke him." Walter's hand slid gently from the frame. "So he sent someone the wrong people would never think to watch," he said. Slowly, he turned to face her, and his eyes were wet and very old and full of something he had been waiting most of his life to finally say. "It was me, child," the old man said. "I took them, every last one of them. Every photograph on this wall." The room went utterly, breathlessly silent. "I stood across the street while you swung on that swing," Walter said. "I sat in the very back of the room while you waited, with your head down, for them to call your name. I watched you carry your boxes up the stairs to that little apartment of yours. I watched you eat your supper alone at that counter in the gray of the afternoon." His voice cracked clean down the middle. "And then I went home, every single night, and I told him, 'She is well. She is growing. She is stronger than she knows. She does not see us, but she is not alone.'" Grace rose from the chair. She crossed the room to the old man, slowly, the little key still held tight in one hand, and she looked up into the lined and weathered face of the stranger who had been, all along, not a stranger at all. "It was you," she whispered, "at the edges, in the doorways, all those years." "It was," Walter said. His old shoulders shook beneath the pressed suit. "Forgive me," he said, "if you are able to find it anywhere in you. I know full well what it must look like, said out loud like this. An old man, lurking, watching a child from across the street." He shook his head, and a tear slid down into the deep lines of his cheek. "There were nights the shame of it sat so heavy on me I could scarcely lift the camera to my eye. There were nights I prayed he would release me from it." His breath caught. "But he had asked it of me, and she had asked it of him. And it seemed to me, in the end, it seemed the one way left in all the world, to keep a promise to a woman who had already given up everything she had to give." Grace looked at him for a long, long moment. She thought in some distant part of her mind that she ought to feel something else. She thought she might feel exposed, violated, that she might feel the cold crawl of a stranger's eyes across all her loneliest years. She thought she might feel frightened or angry or sick with the sheer strangeness of it, but she did not feel any of those things, because for her whole life, Grace had sent the same question out into the dark. Is anyone out there? Does anyone, anywhere, remember me? And here at last, standing before her with trembling hands and a tear-streaked face, was the answer. Yes, someone had been there, not a faceless presence, not a cold and patient watcher in the shadows. A gentle old man who had stood across so many streets in so much rain and so much cold, watching a lonely child grow, and who had gone home each and every night to tell another grieving soul that she was well, that she was loved, that she had not been forgotten. "You weren't lurking," Grace said softly. She reached up and laid her hand over his, where it had come to rest once more against the frame of the little girl on the swing. "You were keeping watch over me," she said, "and there is a whole world of difference between those two things." And the old man bowed his head and wept openly now, without shame, and let her hold his shaking hand against the wall of all those quiet, watchful years. It was Ruth, in the end, who steadied them both. "Now," the old woman said gently, dabbing at her own eyes with a small folded handkerchief. "There is a lock in that room, the child tells us, and a key in her hand to fit it. I should think it is high time the three of us found out exactly what a brave young mother saw fit to hide away, for her daughter to one day discover." So the three of them went down the long corridor together, through the bright, clean door, into the quiet room where the late sun now lay golden across the desk, and the shelves of books, and the great wall of frames. And they searched. Grace ran her fingers along the shelves, behind the rows of old books, beneath the heavy lip of the desk. Walter checked the cold gray stones of the fireplace, the paneling of the walls, the worn boards of the floor, tapping with the patience of a man who has lived long enough to know things are rarely where you first expect them. And Ruth simply stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, her old eyes moving across everything, with the quiet patience of a woman who has learned, across a long life, that the things we hunt hardest for are very nearly always hidden in the one place we would least think to look. And it was Ruth who found it. "There," the old woman said softly. She was pointing, with one thin finger, at the wall of photographs. "Behind them," Ruth said. "Where else in all this house would a mother hide a thing meant for her child, but behind the very face of that child, watched over all those long years by the love she left behind?" Grace crossed to the wall. Her heart had begun to pound. Gently, one by one, she began to lift the frames down from their small nails. The girl on the swing. The girl in the borrowed dress, head bowed. The young woman with the coffee pot and the tired eyes. She set each one down with care, the way you handle something holy. And there, behind them all, set flush into the wall where no careless eye would have found it in 100 years of looking, was a small door, no larger than a single book, plain, unpainted, with a small plain lock set into its center. Grace's breath went shallow and quick. She lifted the tiny key in her trembling fingers. She fit it, carefully, to the lock. And it turned. Inside the little cupboard in the wall sat a single object, a music box, old, wooden, carved with patience by some loving hand, its lid worn smooth as riverstone, its small brass hinges gone soft with the passing of the years. Grace lifted it out with both hands, as though it might dissolve into dust at a single careless touch. It was lighter than she had expected, and heavier, somehow, than the whole wide world. She carried it across the room and set it down upon the desk, in the very center of the pool of golden light. For a long moment, she only looked at it. She was afraid. She understood that, suddenly, standing there, not afraid of what was inside, afraid of how badly she wanted it, afraid of the size of the hope rising up in her chest like a tide, and of how far it would have to fall if she lifted the lid and found nothing inside but silence and dust and the long indifference of the years. Ruth came and stood close at one shoulder. Walter came and stood close at the other. Neither of them said a word. And Grace, with hands that would not quite stop their shaking, reached out and lifted the lid. Music. A soft, thin, silvery melody rose up out of the little box, note by careful note, into the quiet, golden room. A lullaby. And the very moment it touched the air, something deep inside Grace Bennett came quietly apart, because she knew it. She knew it. Not with her mind. Her mind held no memory of the tune at all, but somewhere far below thought, somewhere in the oldest and most hidden room of her. A door she had believed long sealed swung gently open, and the warmth came flooding through it. The vague, impossible impression of being lifted into the air, of being held against someone's warm shoulder, of a hand smoothing her hair back in the dark, slow and tender, while this very melody hummed low against her ear. The song she had half remembered her whole life. The few broken notes she had reached for, again and again, on 1,000 sleepless nights, and never once been able to hold. Here it was, whole, complete. Risen up out of a locked box behind her own watched-over face, she pressed a hand hard against her mouth, and then the melody softened, and beneath it, gently, like a voice rising up slowly from the bottom of a still and ancient well, came something else. A voice. A woman's voice. Recorded long ago, faint and warm and just a little uneven, the way a person's voice goes uneven when they are smiling and weeping at the very same moment. "My Grace," the voice said, and the floor seemed to fall clean away beneath her feet. For her whole life, she had not been able to remember the sound of her mother's voice. It had been the cruelest of all the small, quiet thefts the years had committed against her. She had clung to a face, faded behind a tiny silver hinge. She had clung to a single sentence, pressed into soft metal and worn nearly smooth by her own anxious fingers. But the voice itself, the actual living sound of the woman who had given her life, had slipped away from her, note by note, year by year, until she was no longer even certain it had ever been real, or whether she had simply invented the warmth of it to comfort a lonely child in the dark. And now, here it was, filling the quiet room, like sunlight, filling a window. "My Grace," the voice said again, soft and steady, over the silver thread of the lullaby. "If you are hearing this, then you have grown. You have grown, and somehow you have found your way here, to the things kept safe and waiting for you. And that means you are braver and stronger than even I let myself dream you would become." Grace sank slowly into the worn leather chair. She could not stand. She did not try. "There was so much I wanted to give you," the voice went on, and it trembled now with the weight of all of it. "So many ordinary mornings, so many quiet, unremarkable days. I wanted to teach you to be unafraid of this world. I wanted to be there for every small thing, every scraped knee, every first day, every door you ever walked through. A breath. And I am sorry, my darling. I am so deeply sorry that I was not able to be. The lullaby turned gently beneath the words, patient and bright. But you must listen to me now, the voice said, and it gathered its strength and grew sure. None of it was ever your fault, not one single day of it. Do you hear me, my love? You were never too much. You were never too little. You were never anything at all. But the very greatest joy this heart of mine has ever been given to hold. Tears ran freely down Grace's face now. She did not wipe them away. She did not hide them, the way she had hidden them as a child in narrow, borrowed beds. She let them fall, there in the golden light, with the old woman's hand resting gently on her shoulder, and the old man standing silent and weeping by the wall. And one day, her mother's voice said, softer now, you will come to understand that courage is not the absence of fear. It never was. Courage is the choosing to go on, even with the fear sitting right there beside you, holding your hand the whole way. The voice warmed and brightened and filled with a love that 25 long years had not been able to wear the least bit thin. And if you are hearing this, then I already know something true about you, my Grace. Something I have known from the very beginning. The lullaby rose, sweet and clear. You are stronger than you think, the voice said. Far, far stronger. And no matter how long it takes, no matter what stands in the way of it. I told you once, my darling, and I meant it with every last thing in me. A breath. I will find my way back to you. And then, gently, ever so gently, the little melody began to wind down, note by note, slower now, softer, until at last it came to rest, and the room was quiet once more. Grace did not know how long she sat there. The golden light moved slowly across the floor, the way light does when no one is watching it. At some point, Ruth bent and pressed a soft kiss to the top of her head, the way a grandmother might, and slipped quietly from the room. At some point, Walter laid his trembling hand on her shoulder just once, and then he too withdrew, and let the silence of the room belong to her alone. And Grace sat on in the worn leather chair, in the room a sorry and repentant man had built for her. And she lifted the lid of the little music box again, and again, and then again. She listened to the lullaby until she could hum it under her breath. She listened to her mother's voice until the sound of it was no longer a fragile, frightening thing she was terrified of losing, but a thing she carried now, the way she carried the silver heart against her chest. Close, certain, hers. She was not weeping anymore, not from grief at least. The tears that came now were of an altogether different kind. They were the tears that come when something broken inside a person is, at long and weary last, set gently right. When a question carried in silence for a whole lifetime is finally, fully answered. Was I loved? Yes. The answer had been here the entire time, singing softly in a locked box, behind the face of a child who never once knew she was being watched over, waiting with all the boundless patience of a love that does not die, for the single day she would at last be ready to lift the lid and turn the key and hear it. As for the man with the kind face and the patient smile, the truth, it turned out, was a difficult thing to keep buried. Once it had even a single witness who would no longer be silenced. Ruth, who had spent the better part of a lifetime being beneath everyone's notice, discovered that she was beneath notice no longer. She spoke, quietly, to one person and then another. And once she had spoken, others slowly began to remember that they too were carrying things they had long been afraid to say aloud. Small things, half things, suspicions held close and unspoken for years, for fear of who might be listening. And one by one, gently, in their own time and on their own terms, they began to say them. A soft smile, it seems, can only protect a man for so long. It works only as long as no one is truly looking at him. And the quiet hills had begun, at last, to look. Edward Vance did not stay. Men like him rarely do. Once the comfortable ground beneath their polished shoes begins, ever so slightly, to shift. One gray and ordinary morning, his fine low car went down the long road through the pines for the final time, and the hills closed softly behind him, the way still water closes over a dropped stone, and went back, in time, to being the thing they had always quietly wished to be: peaceful, safe, a place where small and unguarded things might grow up unafraid. Grace felt no triumph when word reached her that he had gone. She felt only a kind of deep and settled stillness. The stillness of a debt long owed, finally laid to rest. Her mother had set herself against the dark in these hills, and had not lived to see the dawn break over them. But the dawn had come, late and slow, the way it so often does. And it had come, in the end, through her daughter's 2 hands. People expected her to sell the great house. That was the sensible thing, they all said, in their kind and well-meaning way. A young woman, alone, with no earthly use for so many empty rooms and so much old sorrow soaked deep into the walls. Take the money, child. Make a fresh start somewhere new. Let the old place go to someone who will not feel its weight in every silent hall. Grace listened to them politely, and then she stayed. She did not turn the great house into anything. She built no monument upon the hill. She hung no sign above the door. She simply lived there. She brought her tools up the long winding road, 1 carload at a time, and she set up her workbench in a wide, sunlit room at the back of the house, where the morning light came in clean and warm. And she went on doing the very thing she had always done, mending broken pieces, finding the good wood hidden patiently beneath the ruin, coaxing grace and beauty back out of the things the world, in its hurry, had given up on and left behind. Ruth came often and stayed long, and the 2 of them filled the great quiet kitchen with the sound of talk. Talk of a woman they had both, in their own separate ways, loved and lost, and somehow, against everything, found again. Walter grew older still, and slower, and his hands shook a little more with every passing season. But he never once stopped tending the place he loved, and the great wall of photographs stayed exactly where it had always been. Grace did not take it down. For a long while, she did not change it at all. It seemed to her a sacred thing, a quiet record of a love that had watched over her through every gray and lonely year, kept faithfully by a gentle old man with a trembling hand and a camera he had been ashamed and unable to put down. But one evening, near the close of a long and golden autumn day, she did, at last, add to it. She took, with her own 2 hands, a single new photograph. And she chose, very carefully, where it would go. Not at the far end of the long row, where the years had stopped. In the center, right in the heart of all those stolen, watched-over years. It was a small and ordinary thing, that photograph. Ruth at the kitchen table, her silver head thrown back, laughing at something long forgotten. Walter beside her, caught mid-word, his old face gone soft with a joy that Grace had never once glimpsed there on the gray day she first arrived. And there, between the two of them, a young woman with her mother's face, smiling, truly smiling. The way a person smiles only when they have finally, at long last, stopped bracing themselves for the next door to close. It was the first photograph on that whole crowded wall that Grace had chosen for herself. The first one that had not been taken from across a street, in secret, by someone who loved her dearly but could not say so. The first one taken up close, in the warm light, by people who were glad, openly and without fear, and without any need to hide it, to be standing right there beside her. And as she pressed it gently into place, among all those long and quiet years, the wall stopped being at last the record of a child who had been watched from a distance. It became, instead, the record of a woman who belonged. On a still evening near the close of that first autumn, Grace stood out on the wide stone steps of the house and watched the sun go slowly down behind the pines. The silver heart rested against her chest, the way it had through every single chapter of her life. But it felt different now, lighter somehow, not because the past had changed. The past does not change. It only waits to be understood. It felt lighter because, at long last, she understood it. The little locket no longer held only loss. It held a key that had unlocked a voice. It held a melody she could now hum softly to herself in the dark, whenever the old loneliness came whispering at the edges of a long night. And it held proof, warm against her own beating heart, that her story had not begun in a borrowed bed in a stranger's cold house, but long, long before that, in the arms of someone brave, someone who had whispered into her small ear that she would find her way back, and who had then spent her last and most frightened days on this earth making certain that, somehow, against everything, she would. Behind Grace, the tall windows of the great house glowed warm and gold. Ruth was inside, humming the lullaby to herself over the supper dishes, for she had learned it now too. The way the people who love us learn the songs that matter. Walter was dozing in his chair beside the fire, an old man finally, fully at peace with the long watch he had kept. And the door at Grace's back, the wide, heavy front door of that house above the trees, was hers. Truly hers. Not a place she was only passing through, not a room she was borrowing for a season, with one ear always cocked for the sound of being moved along again. Not a doorway she stood inside like a polite and careful visitor, quietly hoping that someone, anyone, might be glad to see her come through it. A home, for the first time in 25 years. A real and lasting home. She thought, standing there in the cool blue dusk, of the small girl she had once been. The one with the cupcake. The one with the single, crooked, guttering candle. The one who had closed her eyes, year after lonely year, and sent the very same aching wish out into the empty dark. Please, let there be someone out there who remembers me. And Grace smiled softly into the falling evening, because she finally knew the answer to it. Her mother had remembered her. A gentle old man had remembered her, across every street and through every changing season. A flawed and sorry soul had spent his whole long second life making certain that she would not be forgotten. And a silver-haired woman, beneath everyone's notice, had carried the truth of it like a single candle through years of darkness, waiting, patient as the dawn, to place that small flame at last into Grace's open hands. She had not been forgotten, not on a single one of those long and lonely days. She had only needed to live long enough and stay brave enough, just a little while more, to find the love that had been quietly, faithfully waiting for her all along. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Grace sat alone at her workbench in the back room. A small, battered keepsake box waited beneath her hands. Someone had brought it in for mending. Its hinges rusted stiff, its lid split clean across, the sort of thing most people would have thrown out without a second thought. She worked it slowly, sanding, oiling, coaxing the good wood back up out of the ruin. The same patient work her hands had always known. And as she worked, without quite noticing, she began to hum. The lullaby came easy now. It lived in her. It had lived in her all along, perhaps, folded away beneath all those silent years, waiting for the single day she would be ready to hear it again. She understood something, turning that small box gently in her hands. Her mother had not left her empty. She had left her full, and simply trusted the long years to keep it safe until her girl was strong enough to find it. A key behind a faded photograph. A song beneath the silence. A door somewhere up a winding road that had always been meant to be her own. We spend so much of our lives believing we have nothing, and all the while, we are quietly carrying everything. Grace set the mended box on the shelf where the last of the lamplight caught it. Then she rose. She turned out the light, and she climbed the stairs of the house that was hers. While down below, the wind moved soft through the pines and carried the last few notes of a lullaby out over the dark and quiet hills.